The interstellar accord had existed for 612 years, 43 member species, hundreds of settled worlds, treaties, shared technologies, and the slow, difficult work of building something that looked, from a distance, like civilization. Humans had joined 53 years ago. They were small, quiet, polite mostly. The older races had looked at them the way experienced travelers look at someone who has never left their home country, with a kind of patient tolerance and a private certainty that this newcomer would soon learn how things really worked. The Vorathi, the Accord's oldest warrior race, had a word for humans in their own language that translated roughly as the soft ones who try hard. It was not quite an insult. It was not quite a compliment. It sat somewhere in between, in the space reserved for things that are harmless and slightly endearing. The Accord had been wrong about humans before. It was about to be wrong again. The emergency session of the Grand Council met on Varro's prime station, a great ring of metal and glass turning slowly above a blue gas giant 80 light-years from the nearest human colony. The Grand Chamber held 2,000 seats, tiered in a half-circle around a central display platform. Representatives from every member world had come. Some had 6 arms. Some had no eyes at all. Some breathed gases that would kill a human in under a minute. They had come from the far edges of the known galaxy, traveling fast, because the message that had called them was the kind that made everyone move quickly. They all wore the same expression: fear. The holographic display in the center of the chamber was showing what had been done to Beth Saren. Beth Saren had been a Serenthi colony world, settled for 80 years, home to 200,000. Blue grain fields that stretched to the horizon, a city of pale towers, schools, markets that opened at dawn and stayed open until the second moon came up, a world in the middle of becoming something. 3 weeks ago, the Narvik had arrived. Now Beth Saren was ash and broken stone. The display rotated slowly, showing continent after continent of destruction. Not looting, not occupation, just annihilation carried out in 72 hours, and then the Narvik had left. High Counselor Marath of the Serenthi stood at the podium. He had 4 hands. All 4 of them gripped the edge of the podium hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. His voice was controlled, but only barely. "This is the second world in 6 weeks," he said. Oral's landing fell first, then Beth Saren, both Serenthi colonies, both in the outer reach of the Veth corridor. The line they are drawing is not random. They are moving inward. If the pace holds, they will reach the inner corridor worlds within 4 months. No one spoke. Commander Vethais of the Vorathi rose from his seat. He stood 7 feet tall, gray-skinned, with flat black eyes that had seen combat on 14 worlds. The Vorathi were the finest warriors the Accord had ever produced. Stronger than humans, faster than Serenthi, more durable than almost anything the galaxy had made in the way of living creatures. They had held that reputation for 300 years. In the Grand Chamber, when Vethais spoke, everyone listened. "We have studied the Narvik combat data from both worlds," he said. He spoke slowly, choosing each word. Among Vorathi, that careful speech was a sign of deep unease. "They are unlike anything in our records. They move in near-total darkness and prefer it. They do not use manufactured weapons. They kill with biological tools, bladed limbs, crushing appendages, secretions that dissolve armor. They are fast, they are strong, and they are organized in ways that suggest significant intelligence despite showing no technology." He paused, "and they project fear." That last sentence hit the chamber differently than the rest. Several smaller delegates shifted in their seats. A Serenthi representative gripped the arms of her chair. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a delegate from the Drenathi made the low, humming sound their species used to manage acute distress. Counselor Marath said, "Explain that." The 11 survivors of Beth Saren, all civilians, all in sealed underground storage when the attack began, described a psychological effect unlike anything in our medical literature. Not simply fear in the ordinary sense, something induced, targeted, as if the Narvik could locate whatever was worst inside a person's mind and make it immediate, make it real, make it the only thing in the world. Vethai set down his datapad. Our xenobiologists believe it is a biological emission. Pheromonal and neurological in mechanism. The effect paralyzes prey. It causes trained soldiers to drop weapons. It causes warriors, our warriors, Vorathi, tested fighters, to curl on the ground and become unable to act. He looked around the chamber. The survivors said it felt like dying. They said it felt like every terrible thing they had ever experienced happening all at once. The chamber was very quiet. The Vorathi Blade Guard stands ready, Vethais continued. 600 elite warriors. We can insert them into the Veth corridor within. You will need more than 600. The voice came from the far end of the council arc. A woman, human, small, dark-haired, wearing the plain blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps. Ambassador Yale Chen had been sitting quietly through the entire session. She had a narrow face and eyes that moved steadily across the room, taking things in. She looked like a person who made careful calculations before speaking. Vethais looked at her. Ambassador Chen, Earth maintains no military presence in the Veth corridor. Your colonies are not currently in the projected path of the Narvik advance. Not currently, she said. In 8 months they will be. She folded her hands on the table in front of her. Earth would like to contribute to the response. Vethais made the small head tilt that was a Vorathi's version of polite skepticism. We are glad of Earth's commitment. How many battalions can you provide? We are sending a team, she said. The word landed in the chamber like something small and out of place. A team, said Councillor Marath slowly. 12 soldiers. A pause. Then, from various points around the chamber, sounds that translated across a dozen languages into something resembling laughter. Ambassador Chen did not react, did not blink, sat with her hands folded and looked at the center display, which was still rotating through images of the dead world below. 12, said Vethais. The Vorathi were too proud to laugh, but his tone was close to it. You intend to send 12 humans against the force that erased 2 settled worlds. Yes. What kind of soldiers? She looked at him calmly. Special forces. Sergeant First Class Dominic Van was eating a turkey sandwich in the break room of Firebase Keller when his orders came through. Firebase Keller was Earth's orbital platform over the Northern Hemisphere, 3rd ring, 3rd shift, 200 hours local. The break room had bad lighting and a commissary machine that dispensed mustard that was too sweet. Van was eating the sandwich anyway. He had learned early in his career not to be picky about food, because there were plenty of places in the galaxy where there was no food at all. He read the orders, read them again, set the sandwich down. He went to find his team. They were never far. That was one of the things about these 12 people. They existed in close orbit of each other even when they didn't have to, the way that old soldiers do when the world outside their small group moves too fast and too loud, and is full of people who don't understand what they have seen and done. They didn't talk about it, this closeness. It had just happened over years, the way certain things happen when you survive enough together. Master Sergeant Priya Akafer was in the gym doing weighted pull-ups, her face calm and distant in the way it got when she was working. She didn't stop when Van walked in, just raised an eyebrow. Orders, he said. She dropped from the bar. What kind? Long trip, interesting problem. She looked at him. Akafer had a way of looking at people that felt like she was checking a structural calculation. Dangerous. Unknown, probably yes. She nodded. Give me 2 minutes to get my gear. Corporal Finn Darrow was at a table in the corridor playing solitaire. He had been playing solitaire alone for 20 minutes, which meant he was thinking about something and needed his hands occupied. He looked up when Van stopped. Orders, Darrow said, not a question. Yes. Interesting ones. The whole galaxy is watching. Darrow swept the cards together and stood up. Let's go. It took 40 minutes to collect the rest. Staff Sergeant Luz Reyes, who woke up when Van knocked and was dressed and ready in 90 seconds, coffee in hand. Sergeant Holt, who had been sharpening a knife that didn't need sharpening but did it anyway because it steadied him. Specialists Park, Adami, and Voss, Corporals Tanaka and Breckenridge. Private First Class Maida, the youngest of them, with the quiet face that people consistently underestimated. And Warrant Officer Sable, who handled their technical systems, never gave a first name, and made statements so precisely accurate that they made people uncomfortable. 12 people in a small briefing room, and Van laid it all out. The Narvek, Beth Sarin and Oral's Landing, the Grand Council, Ambassador Chen, 12 humans being sent into the Veth corridor. He waited for the reaction. Reyes leaned back in her chair. Us 12. Yes. Against what destroyed 2 colony worlds. Yes. She nodded. Okay. She took a sip of coffee. What do we know about their movement patterns? That was it. No speech-making. No dramatics. Several of the others shifted in their seats or made small sounds, but nobody stood up. Nobody asked to be pulled. Darrow reached for a pen and started taking notes. Park pulled up the tactical display. The fear projection, said Holt. How close does it need to be to work? Van said, within 30 meters, according to the survivors. Holt looked at the knife in his hand. So they have to come to us. That's right. Good, Holt said, and he put the knife away. They spent 3 hours on the data. Maps, terrain analysis, Narvek biology from the fragments the Accord had managed to recover, movement patterns extrapolated from the attack timelines, the known mechanics of the fear projection, and the single most useful detail in the entire file. The Narvek had never, in any recorded engagement, encountered a target that did not respond to the projection. Every species they had faced had been paralyzed by it. Every time. Maida had asked the question that was in everyone's head. Why does Ambassador Chen think 12 of us changes that? Van said, because she asked for us by name. That settled something in the room. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to recognition. The understanding that the people sending them knew what they were sending, which was sometimes more than soldiers got. They boarded the Varathi transport Long Patience at 300 hours. No ceremony. No crowd. 12 humans with their gear bags, walking through a loading bay, heading for the edge of the known galaxy. Commander Vethais had chosen to travel aboard the Long Patience personally. Among Varathi, this meant he had judged the mission important enough to stake his own life on. It also meant he could observe the humans directly, which he wanted to do, because he had read their service records and found them deeply unusual, and he believed in forming his own conclusions from what he could see. He observed them throughout the 4-day voyage. They were not what he expected. He had served alongside dozens of species. He knew what elite soldiers looked like, controlled, tight, carrying the specific tension of people ready to reach for violence at a moment's notice. The humans had all of that. It was there if you knew where to look. But they also played card games. They argued about food. They talked about people and places Vethais had never heard of, and laughed at things he could not identify as funny. They slept deeply and easily on the hard metal benches of the transport bay. They seemed to require no ritual or routine to calm themselves. The youngest one, Maida, read a paper book every night before sleeping. Vethais asked him about it once, passing through the bay. Poems, Maida said, looking up. Old ones. You read poetry before a combat deployment. Yes. Why? Maida thought about it for a moment, which Vethais appreciated. He disliked people who answered without thinking. Because poems are about the things that matter. Before something hard, it helps to hold the things that matter in your head. Vethais had no answer to that. He left the young soldier to his reading. On the 3rd night, he found Van alone on the observation deck, looking at the stars. The Veth corridor was visible ahead, a dense, dark band of star clusters and cold matter that made navigation difficult and made hiding easy. A good place for something that preferred the dark. They stood in silence for a while. Vethais had found that humans could tolerate silence, which was uncommon among species that had recently joined the Accord. Most new members filled every quiet moment with words. "I read your service record," Vethai said eventually. "I know," said Van. "The operations, the places, the conditions your unit has worked in." Van said nothing. "I want to ask you directly," Vethai said. "Are you afraid going into this?" Van was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Vethai's waited. "We're all afraid," Van said. "Every single person on this ship, we've been afraid our whole careers. Fear is what happens when something is trying to kill you and you're smart enough to know it. It's honest. It means you're paying attention." He paused. "We just don't let it run things. You work in it enough times, you feel it enough times, and it becomes like weather. It's still there, but you put on your coat and you go outside." Vethais looked at him. "The Narvik make fear into a weapon." "I know. You're not worried about that." "Manufactured fear from something outside is one thing," Van said. He touched his temple. "We've all got real things in here, real memories, real losses. Manufactured is amateur hour compared to what we've already been through." Vethais thought about that for a long time after the conversation ended. On the fourth day, the long patience dropped from faster-than-light travel and went dark. No running lights, engines at minimum power. Beth Saren appeared on the sensors, gray-brown, dead, still faintly warm from fires that had burned a week ago. Van gathered his team in the drop bay. He looked at each of them, 12 faces. "This is what we came for," he said. "Let's go to work." Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything brave or notable. They checked their gear, loaded their weapons, and climbed into the drop pods. And somewhere in the dark of the Veth corridor, in a fortress that had never been threatened, something ancient and predatory felt, for the first time, something it had no word for. Something faint and unfamiliar that was not quite an emotion and not quite a warning. It dismissed it. It would not make that mistake again. They landed on Beth Saren at night. No lights, no landing burn. The drop pods came in dark, guided entirely by Sable's navigation, and hit the ground with soft, controlled impacts across a scatter pattern half a kilometer wide. The landing site had been chosen carefully, the ruins of the colony's outer district, where the buildings were collapsed enough to break up their silhouettes but still intact enough to provide cover. Keth had insisted on joining them on the ground. He was Vorathi, one of Commander Vethais's senior officers, a warrior with 22 years of combat experience across 9 documented engagements. He had volunteered for the observer role because he wanted to see these humans work with his own eyes. Records were one thing. He believed in what he could observe directly. His pod cracked open. Cold air came in fast, thin atmosphere, temperatures below freezing, and underneath the cold, a smell. Something burnt, and beneath the burning, something organic and wrong, like the aftermath of a slaughterhouse that had been lit on fire. He stepped out. The humans were already out of their pods, all 12 of them already oriented, already moving, quiet and efficient in the dark in a way that reminded Keth of a mechanism switching on. No adjustment period, no hesitation, just immediate function. Van materialized at his shoulder. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Don't use your light unless I say." "I have 22 years of—" "I know," Van said. "Stay close anyway." There was no argument in his voice, no edge, just the calm statement of someone who had made a decision and was not going to waste time discussing it. Keth stayed close. They spent the first 2 hours moving through what had been the colony's residential district. Keth had seen destroyed worlds before. The Vorathi had fought wars. He had walked through the aftermath of battles and known what mass death looked like. But there was something about Beth Saren that was different in a way he found difficult to name. It was the absence of anything defensive. There were no barricades, no positions where the colonists had tried to fight back, no scorch marks from return fire. The destruction was entirely one-sided. The Narvik had moved through this world the way a storm moves through a forest. The forest does not fight back. It simply ceases to exist. The humans moved through it systematically. Reyes and Akafer took the west side of each block while Tanaka and Park took the east. Holt and Voss held a moving rear guard. Maida and Breckenridge worked the center. Van and Darrow ranged ahead, reading terrain. Sable moved behind Van, constantly pulling sensor data and running it through the analysis unit on her forearm. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was in short, flat sentences. Corner clear. Movement sensor negative. Shell structure compromised, go around. Keth watched them read the ground the way a hunter reads tracks, not just looking, but building a picture. Adami crouched at one point beside a set of marks in the ash-covered ground and studied them for nearly 2 minutes without moving. Then he stood and made a gesture with 2 fingers that sent Van jogging quietly to his position. They conferred in low voices for 30 seconds. "What did you find?" Keth asked, coming up behind them. Adami showed him the marks, 3 parallel lines deep, evenly spaced, and beside them a 4th set at an angle, bladed limb drag. It paused here. He pointed to a slight depression in the ash. Crouched, turned to look at that building. He pointed left. Then went that way. He pointed toward the center of the city. "You can read that from marks in ash," Keth said. "He can read that from marks in ash," Van said. "This is what Adami does." Adami stood up and kept moving. By midnight, they had built a clear enough picture. The Narvik had moved in from the north. They had swept south in a coordinated pattern that was not random, organized, deliberate, dividing the colony into sectors and clearing each one. They had withdrawn to the north after approximately 60 hours, and the trail was still fresh enough to follow. They set up in the ruins of a large storage building on the colony's northern edge. It had thick walls, only 2 entry points, and a partial roof that still held. The humans set their perimeter, sensors, tripwires, 3 overlapping fields of fire in about 8 minutes. Keth had watched his own unit set perimeters. It usually took longer. "They'll come back," Van said, looking north. "They always go back to check their kills." "How do you know that?" Keth asked. Van looked at him. "Because that's what hunters do." The Narvik came at 300 hours. The sensors tripped first. Sable's voice came through the comm, flat and precise. North and east, multiple signatures, closing fast. No alarm. No one scrambled. The humans simply moved to their positions. It happened with a smoothness that suggested they had done this, or something exactly like this, many times before in many different dark places. Keth had his weapon raised. He was positioned behind a collapsed wall section, a good firing angle on the northern approach. He was watching the dark through his targeting scope. Then the fear hit him. It was not like anything he could have prepared for. He had read the reports. He knew the mechanism, pheromonal, neurological, induced. He had told himself it was a biological process, a chemical effect, no different from any other hazard. He had believed on some level that his experience would protect him. He had been wrong. It came like something opening inside his chest, not from outside, from inside, from the deepest part of him, from the place where every soldier keeps the memories they don't look at directly, the faces of those he had lost, the engagement on Verlith Station where he had made a decision in 3 seconds that had killed 6 of his own people, the smell of their blood, the way the sound of the battle had continued around the silence of what he had done, things he had managed, things he had put in a sealed room inside himself and never unlocked again. The Narvik unlocked them all. His legs stopped working. He grabbed the wall beside him and held on. The scope was still up, but he could not make his eye work properly. The fear was not simply present, it was total, filling every piece of him the way water fills a vessel, leaving no room for anything else. He heard firing. It was coming from every direction around him. The humans were shooting. He could see their shapes in his peripheral vision, could register that they were standing, moving, working. He could not understand it. He was on his knees, barely holding the wall, and they were working. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. He knew the length because Sable announced it afterward. 6 minutes 14 seconds, All contacts neutralized, no casualties. Keth became aware that the fear was fading. Not gone, not entirely, but decreasing, the way a fever breaks and you can feel yourself returning. He pulled himself upright using the wall. His legs were unsteady. The first Narvik body he saw was 3 meters away. In the dim light of the early morning, it was larger than he had expected, 2 meters long, 6-limbed, with a carapace that had a dark iridescent quality. The bladed forelegs were massive. He could see clearly how those limbs had done what they had done on this world. There were 7 bodies visible from his position. He counted them twice. 7 in 6 minutes by 12 soldiers, while the Narvik's fear projection was in full effect. HFY was beside the nearest body, examining it. She had a light out now. She was studying the carapace with what appeared to be professional curiosity. Interesting joint structure, she said to no one in particular. We'll get better data from the second group, Adami said. Keth looked at them. Second group. There's a second group about 400 meters north, Sable said. They stopped when the first group didn't come back. They're waiting. She glanced at Keth without expression. They didn't project from that range. You should be functional again in another few minutes. He was aware, suddenly, that he was still gripping the wall. He let go of it. Van found him sitting on a piece of rubble 10 minutes after the engagement. The humans were doing their post-contact sweep, methodical, moving through the ruins in pairs. Van came and sat on a piece of rubble nearby. He did not comment on what had happened to Keth during the fight. He just sat there for a moment, looking north. I need you to tell me something, Keth said. If I can, Van said. During the projection, you felt it. It was not quite a question. Van answered anyway. Yes, he said. Keth looked at him. You kept fighting. Yes. How? Van was quiet for a moment. He picked up a small piece of broken stone from the ground, turned it over in his fingers, and set it down. Have you ever been in water so cold it makes your hands stop working? Keth said, not exactly, but I understand the condition. When your hands stop working, you don't stop swimming. You figure out how to do what you need to do without your hands working the way they should. He paused. The projection is like that. It shuts down the part of you that is comfortable and okay. The part that expects things to make sense and be manageable. But that part was never the part doing the work anyway. He looked north. We don't stop. We've never had the luxury of stopping. So the projection takes away something we weren't using. Keth sat with that for a while. You have all felt worse than that, he said. Genuinely, not as a figure of speech. Yes, Van said. Keth thought about the sealed room inside himself, the things the Narvik had opened. Your training. We don't just train in physical conditions, Van said. We train in psychological ones, specifically to find the bottom of what a person can experience and still function. We go there deliberately, repeatedly, until functioning there is just another skill. He paused again. The Narvik give you manufactured terror. We've sat inside real terror and practiced. There's a difference. Keth sent his first report to Commander Vethais at 400 hours. He included the engagement data, the body count, the time. He included the detail about the fear projection and its effect on him, which was a difficult thing to write, and he wrote it anyway because accuracy mattered more than pride. At the end, he added one additional observation. They do not fall to the projection, he wrote. All 12 maintained full combat function throughout. I do not yet have a complete explanation for this. What I can say is this. Whatever these humans have experienced and survived in their own history, it has made the Narvik's primary weapon into a secondary inconvenience. We underestimated them. The Council underestimated them. Whatever comes next, I will not make that mistake again. He sent the report and looked at the northern horizon, where the second group of Narvik was waiting in the dark. The humans were already packing up. We moving? Holt asked Van. We're moving, Van said. Maida shouldered his pack. He was eating something, one of the dense nutritional bars the unit carried. He offered one to Keth as he passed, without a word. The way you'd offer someone something if they looked like they needed it. Keth took it. They moved north into the dark, following a trail that would take them out of this dead world and deeper into the corridor. Somewhere ahead, the Narvik had a home, a place they came from and returned to, a center. That was where they were going. Behind them, Beth Saren settled back into silence. The ash was undisturbed now, and in the quiet ruins, 7 Narvik bodies lay still in the pale light of an early dawn. And for the first time since they had begun their expansion through the Veth corridor, the second group of Narvik, 400 meters to the north, had stopped advancing. They were waiting, uncertain. Their scouts had gone silent. Something in the dark ahead of them was not behaving the way prey was supposed to behave. They did not know yet what to do with that. They would learn, but the lesson would not be the one they expected. The trail led them out of Beth Saren's system and deeper into the Veth corridor. Commander Vethais met them in orbit, aboard the Long Patience. With a fleet of 3 support vessels and 2 additional ground teams he had decided to attach to the mission. The first was a unit of Vorathi warriors, 12 of the Blade Guard, under the command of 2nd Blade Orath, a veteran of 11 engagements who wore his combat history in the pattern of ceremonial cuts along his forearms. The second was a group of Serenthi scouts called the Grey Step, 6 of them, small and light and almost supernaturally quiet, bred for the kind of work that required invisibility over strength. He had also read Keth's report 3 times. When Van and his team came aboard from the planetary surface, Vethais met them at the docking bay. He stood in the middle of the corridor, and when Van walked in with ash still on his boots and 7 Narvik contacts behind him, Vethais did the thing that among Vorathi meant the highest professional acknowledgement. He moved aside to let them pass first. Van noticed. He said nothing. He nodded, which among humans meant something similar. "We tracked them back to the 3rd planet in the Veth 7 system," Van said, walking beside Vethais toward the briefing room. "They're not just passing through the corridor. They came from somewhere." "We believe so," Vethais said. "Our long-range sensors have identified a structure on the dark side of Veth 7's 3rd moon, very large, partially organic in composition." "A hive," Van said. "We believe so," Vethais said again. "Then that's where we're going." Vethais looked at him. "The Blade Guard and the Grey Step will go with you." "I know," Van said. "Brief them on the fear projection. Specifically, brief them that it will work on them and they need a plan for when it does." Vethais paused. "And your team?" Van's expression didn't change. "We have a plan already." Veth 7's 3rd moon had no name in any Accord catalog. It was barely large enough to qualify as a moon, a dark, dense mass of rock and frozen compounds, tidally locked so that one side faced the parent planet in permanent illumination and the other faced open space in permanent dark. The Narvik had built their fortress on the dark side. The insertion force made landfall in 3 waves, 30 kilometers from the target. The Long Patience hung in a low orbit at minimum power, silent as a drifting rock. Vethais was aboard. Keth was on the ground. The terrain was difficult. Broken volcanic rock, fields of frozen gas that had been solid for millions of years, and elevation changes sharp enough to be dangerous in the low gravity. There was no atmosphere to speak of. They moved in sealed environment suits, which limited some things and helped others. The suits had thermal regulation, which was important because the temperature on the dark side of the moon was cold enough to kill an unprotected organism in 3 minutes. They moved in a column. The Grey Step scouts took the point, spread across a 400-meter front. The Blade Guard followed, Orath at their center. Then the humans, steady and quiet, with Keth moving alongside Van. For the first 3 hours, nothing happened. It was a different kind of hard work than combat, the sustained physical effort of moving through difficult terrain in heavy suits while keeping noise discipline and field awareness. The Vorathi were built for it and showed no difficulty. The Grey Step were almost supernatural in how quietly they moved across rock. The humans moved with a methodical, ground-eating pace that covered distance efficiently without ever looking hurried. Keth found himself watching them again. He had been doing this since Beth Saren, studying them, trying to find the pattern. He noticed that they talked more than he expected during movement. Not constantly, they maintained discipline, but in quiet short bursts during natural pauses. Not tactical talk, other things. Park told Adami something about his daughter's first steps, 2 sentences, no more. Reyes and Breckenridge had a brief, low conversation about something they had eaten at a place on Earth called the Taco Stand on 8th that had apparently been extremely important to them. Holt, who spoke the least of any of them, hummed something very quietly to himself. The same 4 notes, over and over, like a calibration sound. They carried the weight of the mission and talked about their lives inside it. Keth did not know what to do with that. The Vorathi did not mix the two. When you were on a mission, you were the mission. Personal history was a different drawer, kept closed during operational periods. The humans kept all their drawers open. He asked Van about it during a rest period. Makes the job smaller, Van said simply. The job gets very large in your head if you let it. You think about the stakes, the consequence, the outcome, and it grows until you can't see anything else. Talk about something real, something from your actual life, and it brings everything back to size. The job is just a job. It doesn't get to be everything. Keth thought about that. Does it work? He asked. We're here, aren't we? The projection started 6 hours in. It was low at first, a background hum of unease, too subtle to identify as external. Keth felt it as a slight wrongness, like a sound at the edge of hearing that you weren't sure was real. The Serenthi scouts registered it before anyone admitted it. He could see it in the way their movement changed, slightly less fluid, slightly more careful. Second Blade Orath said nothing, but Keth knew Orath, and he could see the slight tightening in the Vorathi's posture that meant he felt it too. By hour 7, it was not subtle anymore. Keth was walking and the sealed room inside him was opening again. It did it quietly this time, not the sudden flood of the first night, but a slow seep. Memories at the edges of his thoughts. The engagement on Verlith Station. The 6 he had lost. He knew, with the rational part of his mind, that this was the projection, biological, chemical, not real. He had that knowledge clearly. It did not help. He focused on the ground in front of him. Rock, step, rock, step. One of the Grey Step scouts stopped. The scout's name was Sarenvel. She was the best of the 6, the one their unit commander had called the finest tracker he had produced in 15 years. She stood in the middle of the column and she stopped, and then she sat down on the frozen rock, and she did not get up. The column halted. Her unit commander went to her, spoke to her quietly. She did not respond. She was curled slightly, arms around her knees, and the subtle vibration in her body that could be seen even through the environment suit told everyone everything they needed to know. The projection had found her bottom. Reyes was there in 4 seconds. She crouched beside Sarenvel, spoke to her in a clear, calm voice through the suit comms. The words were in Serenthi basic phrases, and she got them roughly right. I see you. You're on the ground, you're solid, feel the ground. She put one hand on the Serenthi's back, firm and steady. Breathe, count the breaths, start at 10. Sarenvel's trembling slowed, not gone but slower. Orath stood nearby. She cannot continue, he said. She will continue, Reyes said, not harshly, as a fact. Give her 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, Sarenvel got up. She was not okay. The look in her eyes, visible through her visor, was the look of someone who had been shown something they would not easily put back. But she was on her feet. Reyes walked beside her for the next 2 hours. The second Grey Step who broke did not sit down. He ran. He simply turned and went fast back the way they had come, in silence, moving at the top speed the low gravity allowed. His unit commander called after him twice, then stopped. Orath looked at Van. 2 of my blade guard are managing, Orath said. Barely. He said it as a professional assessment, not a complaint. The effect is strengthening as we close the distance. I know, Van said. Your team, Oreth said carefully. Still good, Van said. Oreth looked at the humans moving steadily through the column. Park was saying something quiet to Maida, and Maida was nodding. Adami was reading his sensor display and making notations. Holt was humming his 4 notes. Why? Oreth asked. Van thought about it for a moment. You've seen combat, you've been afraid. In combat, you felt afraid and you kept going. Yes, Oreth said, that was simply the job. My unit has trained specifically in fear. Not just combat, not just danger, we have been put deliberately and repeatedly into the worst psychological places a person can survive, not to make us unafraid, to make functioning while afraid into something the body knows how to do the way it knows how to breathe. He looked at Orath. Your blade guard are trained to fight through pain, physical pain. My unit is trained to fight through this. They've been in this room before many times. They know the walls. Orath absorbed this. Humans do this to their own soldiers. To their best ones, Van said, voluntarily. Orath said nothing for a long moment. Then, a strange species. Yes, Van said, and something in his voice suggested he agreed completely. They found the fortress 15 kilometers ahead. Darrow saw it first on the long-range optics, a shape against the permanent black of the horizon that didn't match the rock around it. He signaled a halt without sound, just a fist up, and the column stopped. The shape resolved on magnification into something that was difficult to look at directly. Not because of the projection, that was present but manageable now. A constant background noise the humans wore like bad weather. But because the fortress itself was wrong in a fundamental visual way. It was large. Very large. The initial estimate was 3 kilometers across and several hundred meters tall in its highest sections. It was built from the rock of the moon and from something else, something that had been added to the rock and had changed it, darkened it, given it a texture that was almost biological, like the surface of a living organ enlarged to the scale of a building. The outer walls breathed. Not visibly, not quickly, but the sensors confirmed it. The fortress was alive in some sense, not an independent creature, but not simply a construction either. The Narvek had grown it as much as they had built it. There were no lights. It was perfectly dark against the starfield. The humans gathered around Van and Sable, and the holographic display she projected from her forearm unit. The display showed the fortress in the pale blue lines of sensor interpretation. 4 main entry points, Sable said. Here, 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 here. The largest is on the north face, wide enough for a significant force to enter or exit. The other 3 are smaller, possibly auxiliary. Internal layout is unclear. The walls have a density that limits deep sensor penetration. But thermal imaging shows concentrated heat signatures in the lower center of the structure. That's the core. That's where the Hydamark is, said Adami. Everyone looked at him. All their movements have radiated from a single point on the approaches, he said. Everything comes from and returns to the lower center. There's a command intelligence in there, something that controls the whole operation. He paused. It's been in that room the entire time. Then that's where we go, Van said. Keth looked at the fortress on the display. 3 kilometers of unknown internal structure, an unknown number of Narvek, and a fear projection that had already broken 2 of the finest scouts the Serenthi produced, and had 2 of the Vorathi Blade Guard fighting for function. I want to make something clear, Keth said. Everyone looked at him. I will complete this mission, he said. I will be at reduced effectiveness during the assault due to the projection, but I will not stop. I want that understood. Van looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. It was the same nod he had given Vethais in the docking bay, the one that among humans meant genuine respect, offered simply and without excess. Maida found a flat rock beside the display and sat on it. He had his paper book out, the small one. He read for about 4 minutes in silence, turning pages slowly. Then he put it away and stood up and picked up his weapon. Orath watched him. What does he read? Poems, Keth said. Orath was quiet. Then, about what? The things that matter, Keth said, before something hard. The assault began 2 hours before the long day cycle would bring the parent planet's reflected light around to the dark side. They had that window, 2 hours of total dark, which was their element as much as the Narvek's, because the humans had trained in it, and because darkness was not something you feared when you had already sat in the worst dark, a mind could produce and found your way back out again. The column split into 3 groups. They moved toward the fortress. Inside it, in the deep heat of the central chamber, the Hydamark of this colony, oldest, strongest, the one who had directed the destruction of 2 worlds, felt the projection push out from itself in the maximum radius. It filled the dark of the moon for 2 kilometers in every direction. Every living thing within that radius felt it. Most of them stopped. Not all of them. The Hydamark sent that information forward through its neural network to the warriors positioned at the entry points. The signal carried urgency, something it had never had reason to send before. Prepare for entry. Something is coming that does not stop. The breach began in darkness and it stayed in darkness. That was Van's call, made 2 hours before insertion, and it was the right call. The Narvek fortress had no artificial light. The creatures did not need it, they navigated by biological means, some combination of sensory organs that the Accord's xenobiologists had not fully mapped. Every other force that had faced the Narvek had brought lights, had illuminated their own positions, had made themselves visible in terrain the enemy owned completely. The humans wore thermal and sensor optics and went in dark. Group 1 hit the north face entry point, the large one with Oreth and the 4 functional blade guard, plus Van, Holt, and Rays. Group 2 took the eastern auxiliary entry with the 3 remaining Grey Step scouts in Park, Adami, and Breckenridge. Group 3 held the southern face and the perimeter with Darrow, Voss, Tanaka, Maida, Sable, and Keth, ready to move in on command or seal any exit that the Narvek tried to use. At 12 hours, Van said one word into the comm. Go. The north face entry was not a door. It was an opening in the fortress wall that had been grown rather than constructed. The edges of it were organic, dark, smooth like old bone. It was 3 meters wide and 4 meters tall, and it led into a passage that curved immediately to the left so that nothing outside could see what was inside. Van went through first. The passage was warm. The walls radiated heat. The floor had a texture like bark, not stone, not metal, the biological element of the fortress becoming more apparent the deeper they went. It was quiet except for a low sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, a subsonic vibration that wasn't quite a sound and wasn't quite a feeling. The fear projection was stronger inside, significantly stronger. Oreth went down on one knee 12 meters in. He caught himself on the wall, pushed back up, kept moving. His combat discipline was extraordinary. Whatever the projection was doing to him, he was taking each step the way a person climbs in the face of a strong wind, leaning into it, refusing to stop while the body could still refuse. Holt reached back and put a hand on Oreth's shoulder for exactly 2 seconds, not stopping, just contact, then forward again. Oreth moved. They came around the curve of the passage, and the fortress opened up. The interior was vast. The sensor optics couldn't fully render the scale of it. Estimates put the ceiling at 40 meters. The space was divided by formations that rose from the floor and hung from above, like the ribs of some enormous body, creating natural corridors and chambers within the larger space. The thermal optics lit it all up in shades of orange and red, and in those corridors and between those formations, Narvek moved. Dozens of them. More coming into view as seconds passed. Van made the assessment in the time it took to exhale, then he fired. The fight that followed inside the fortress bore no resemblance to the clean engagements in training scenarios. It was close. It was constantly moving, 3-dimensional with threats from above as well as ahead, as the Narvek used the formations as climbing terrain. It was loud. The sealed suits carried external audio, and the sounds of a Narvik in close combat were something Keth would later describe in his report as the most alarming acoustic experience of my military career. Shrieking, clicking, the hard crack of the bladed limbs on the formation walls. The humans moved through it like water through complicated terrain, adapting, redirecting, never holding a position long enough to be surrounded, never abandoning a corridor without clearing it, working in pairs and then in groups of 4 and then briefly as a unit and then back in pairs as the terrain changed around them. Rays went around a corner and directly into a Narvik that had been waiting on the ceiling above the passage. It dropped onto her. She went down under its weight. Holt was there in 2 seconds. One hand yanked the creature's foreleg and redirected the blade. The other put a weapon into the gap below its carapace. Rays was back up in 4 seconds. They kept moving. Orath watched this. He was functioning, barely. The projection was at maximum this close to the center, and each step felt like walking against a current made of everything terrible. But he was functioning, and he was watching the humans, and what he was watching was something he had no prior category for. They were not unaffected. He could see it if he looked carefully, the slight additional tension in movement, the fractional extra effort in every action, the way Ray's breath through her nose instead of her mouth after the ceiling ambush, a technique for managing adrenaline he recognized. The projection was hitting them. They were simply continuing. He had thought, when he volunteered for this mission, that he understood the limits of what a living creature could do under psychological pressure. He was reevaluating. Group 2 hit the eastern approach at the same time and drove inward. The eastern section of the fortress was narrower, the formations closer together, the passages tighter. The Gray Step scouts were in their element here. They were built for exactly this kind of close-quarters, low-light movement. The 3 who had made it to the assault were clearly fighting the projection, but they were moving, because Rays had spent 3 hours walking beside Sarenvel and teaching her the breathing technique and the 10 count, and Sarenvel had taught it to the others, and imperfect tools are still tools. Park took the technical work, mapping the interior in real time, feeding data back to Sable, building a picture of the internal layout. Adami read the trail. The Narvik moved in patterns even inside their own fortress, driven by whatever organizational structure the Hydamark imposed, and Adami could feel those patterns in the way his eyes moved across a room. He navigated by them the way a person navigates by current in deep water. "Down," he said at one point sharply, and everyone dropped, and 3 Narvik passed through the intersection ahead without looking their way. They went around, kept going. "We're 100 meters from the center chamber," Park said on the comm. Van's voice came back. "We're 200, drive hard." They drove. Keth heard the firefight through the comms. Flashes of it in tactical calls, movement reports, the sounds of engagement that leaked through open mics. He was on the south perimeter, outside the fortress wall, watching the exterior with the others. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Not because of the action, because of the waiting. The projection at this range was a constant pressure, the worst parts of his memory sitting at the front of his mind like uninvited guests he couldn't make leave. He used the breathing. He counted. He kept his eyes moving across the exterior wall, sector by sector, checking for any Narvik attempting to exit. Maida was 10 meters away doing the same thing, scanning his sector. He was humming Holt's 4 notes quietly, almost unconsciously. Darrow was at the northwest corner, still as stone. Tanaka had positioned himself on an elevated piece of rock and was the highest point in their perimeter, the best angle on the exterior. Sable was managing the sensor network, and the comm relay simultaneously, feeding data to both assault groups in real time. "Movement," she said, "flat, informational, south face, they're going to push out." 22 Narvik came through a section of wall that opened without warning, not a door, just an organic gap that appeared and then closed behind them. The assault on the inside had pushed them back, and they were routing, and they were coming out into the waiting perimeter. Keth stood up. The fear projection from the exiting Narvek hit him fully at close range, and his vision went gray at the edges, and he stood up anyway and fired. Maida was firing. Darrow, Tanaka, Voss. The perimeter was small, 6 people, one of them Keth, and 22 Narvek was not a manageable engagement under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. They were fighting in maximum projection range, in the dark, on terrain they had been standing on for exactly 40 minutes. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. Afterward, Keth was sitting on the frozen rock of the moon's surface and Voss was beside him. Voss was not saying anything. She had taken a hit from one of the bladed limbs. The suit was scored across the left shoulder, intact but damaged, and she was running a diagnostic on the suit's integrity with one hand while she kept her weapon ready with the other. She looked at Keth, checked that he was functional, looked away. No comment on his condition. No performance of concern. Just acknowledgement that he was there. He found this, oddly, the most stabilizing thing anyone had done for him in the last 12 hours. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Suit's fine," she said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She glanced at him again, almost smiled. "The limb hit the suit hard. It'll bruise. I'll deal with it later." She looked back at her sector. "We can talk about it at the debrief." Van reached the central chamber 4 minutes after Park announced the range. The chamber was enormous. Even with thermal optics, the full extent of it was unclear. The low subsonic sound was loudest here, a vibration that moved through the floor and the walls and the air, or what passed for air in the sealed space. The biological quality of the fortress was at its most extreme. The walls here were clearly alive, moving in slow rhythms like a breathing chest. And in the center of the chamber, the Heidemark. Van had seen the extrapolated size estimates in the briefing file. He had prepared himself for something large. The preparation was insufficient. The Heidemark was 4 meters tall in its resting configuration, with 6 primary limbs and secondary structures along its dorsal surface that served purposes he could only partly guess at. Its carapace was not the dark iridescence of the smaller Narvek. It was black with an absolute quality, like looking at an absence rather than a surface. The fear projection hit Van like a wall. The worst thing, the specific worst thing that his mind held, the one he had carried for 11 years, the one that had changed what he was, not a memory of being afraid, but a memory of being responsible for something that had gone wrong in ways that could not be corrected or undone or forgiven. The faces, the names. He had all 11 names memorized still, which was a form of discipline he had imposed on himself, and a form of punishment he had never stopped paying. He felt all 11. He kept walking. The Heidemark's secondary structures shifted. It was watching him. He was still 30 meters away, moving steadily across the chamber floor. It projected harder. Oreth went down behind him. Not out, Keth would report later that Oreth had gotten back up within 2 minutes, but down. 3 of the 4 blade guard were on the floor. Reyes was upright, barely, her hand on one of the formation columns. Holt was moving beside Van, slower than normal, his jaw set in a way that turned his whole face into a single expression of refusal. The Heidemark did something then that Van had not seen in the engagement data. It spoke. The sound was not language by any recognizable structure, but Sable's translation system had enough Narvek acoustic data from the Accord's records to produce something approximate. The words came through Van's earpiece in a flat, mechanical render. "What are you?" Not a question. The inflection in Narvek biology didn't produce questions the way human speech did. It was a statement of classification failure. It was the sound of something that had cataloged every prey species in the Veth corridor, encountering something that did not fit any category. Van kept walking. He was 15 meters away. He said human. 10 meters. He raised his weapon. The Heidemark projected everything it had. Van felt every one of the 11 names again and something underneath them that was older and less defined, the rawest thing at the bottom of everything he had survived. His legs were heavy. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. He fired. The shot was not dramatic. It was placed exactly where the Accord's xenobiological data said the primary neural cluster of a Narvik of this class was located, slightly below and behind the first dorsal structure, in the gap between two carapace sections. He fired twice, standard protocol, one to breach and one to confirm. The Heidemark made a sound that the translation system could not render. It fell. The subsonic vibration stopped immediately. The organic walls of the chamber slowed their movement. The projection, the enormous, total, sustained projection of the Heidemark, cut off as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was extraordinary. Reyes sat down heavily on the floor, not because she chose to, but because her legs made the choice. Holt put his back against a formation column and slid down it. Orath, who had gotten up again and walked to the chamber entrance, stood with both hands on the wall, breathing. Van stood in the middle of the chamber floor and looked at what he had done. Then he said into the comm, "Primary target down, begin sweep." His voice was exactly the same as it had been when he said, "Go," at the start of the assault. From outside, Keth heard it. He stood up off the rock where he had been sitting and checked his weapon and moved toward the fortress entry point. Inside, the humans were already sweeping. When Keth entered the chamber 2 minutes later, Holt was on his feet again and moving through the secondary spaces along the chamber wall. Reyes was checking the Heidemark's body with the same professional curiosity Akaffer had shown at the first engagement site on Beth Saren. Park was updating the map. Darrow, who had come in from the perimeter with the secondary group, was eating a nutritional bar. He offered one to Keth as he passed. "Structural integrity on the west wing is compromised," Sable said. "We should move in 40 minutes. "Copy," said Van. He was standing in the center of the chamber, looking up at the ceiling, which moved in its slow, diminishing rhythm as the fortress reacted to the loss of its Heidemark. He stood there for a moment with his eyes up and his face still, and then he looked back down and began checking his weapon for the next movement. Orath watched him. He had never seen anything like this. He had never wanted to, exactly, but now that he had, it changed something in how he understood the word soldier. He thought about what Van had said in the dark of the corridor on the long patience, weeks ago, about fear being weather, about putting on your coat. He thought about the Heidemark asking what they were. He thought about the answer. One word, flat and factual and entirely sufficient. Human. The fortress died slowly. It took 6 hours after the Heidemark fell. The organic elements of the walls began to retract, contracting like muscle releasing tension, and the surfaces that had been warm became cool, and the subsonic vibration that had been the background noise of the entire interior faded to silence and then stopped completely. By the time the assault force withdrew to the surface, large sections of the inner structure had collapsed inward, the biological architecture failing without the central intelligence that had sustained it. The rock of the moon remained, the fortress that had been grown into and from it was becoming memory. The Narvik inside had been cleared. Not all of the colony had been in the fortress. The long-range sensors showed that a significant number had been dispersed across the moon's surface and in the surrounding space, in smaller groups, functioning as scouts and hunting parties. When the Heidemark fell, these groups registered the loss through whatever biological network connected them to the colony intelligence. The response was immediate. They stopped what they were doing and went still. Then they scattered. Not in any organized way, not retreating to a fallback position or consolidating to mount a counterattack. They simply dispersed, individual Narvik moving away in random vectors, as if something that had been holding them in coherent organization had been cut, and without it they had no more structure than a swarm of insects that had lost its queen. Some of them moved toward the outer edges of the Veth corridor. Some moved into deep space. Some simply stopped moving entirely. The long patience collected sensor data on all of it. Commander Vethais watched the display in silence for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, What does a Narvik feel when its Hydamark dies? No one on the bridge had an answer. The assault force had 4 injured, all human, none serious. Reyes had a burn on her left forearm, where a Narvik secretion had gotten through a gap in her suit during the chamber fight, nothing the medical kit on the long patients couldn't manage. Holt had a deep bruise along his right side from taking a blunt impact, the kind that makes breathing uncomfortable for a week, but causes no real damage. Adami had a cut on his chin from falling against a formation column in the dark. Maida, who had not been inside the fortress but had held the perimeter in maximum projection range for over 2 hours, had developed a severe headache that the unit medic said would pass in 48 hours. No Vorathi casualties, no Greystep casualties. Oreth came to Van while the medical assessment was being done and stood beside him in the corridor of the long patients for a long moment before speaking. In 11 engagements, Oreth said finally, I have never seen what I saw in that chamber. Van said, you held through a lot of it. Barely. Oreth looked at his hands. He had ceremonial cuts along his forearms from every engagement he had survived. He was thinking, Van guessed, that he would add this one and that the mark for this one would carry a meaning he did not yet have words for. The projection at its maximum, when the Hydamark pushed everything. I was on the floor. He paused. You kept walking. Yes, Van said. I want to understand how. Van thought about it. He was tired, the bone-deep tired that comes after sustained high-stress operation, when the body has used everything it has and is making clear it would like some of it back. He thought carefully because he wanted to give Oreth an honest answer, not a simple one. You know the moment in a hard engagement, he said, where you've been hit, or you're exhausted, or things have gone wrong, and there's a split second where you could stop, where the part of you that's afraid of dying talks to the part of you that decides, and in that split second, one of 2 things happens. Oreth was listening. You stop or you keep going, and the second or third time that choice comes, it's a little faster. The 10th time, it's not really a choice anymore. The 50th time, the option to stop has mostly disappeared from the menu. He paused. We train specifically to have that conversation as many times as possible before a mission, so that by the time we're in the mission, the choosing part is just habit. Oreth was quiet then, and the Hydamark's projection was another version of that split second, with more force behind it, but the same conversation. Van looked at him. You got back up. I did, Oreth said. Then you understand more than you think you do. Commander Vethais filed his mission report 17 days after the operation. He was a methodical writer, and the report was thorough. Tactical data, engagement timelines, casualty assessment, analysis of the Narvik response to the death of the Hydamark. He sent it ahead to the Grand Council with a notation requesting that Ambassador Chen be present for the discussion session. The Grand Council met 3 days after that. The Grand Chamber was full. Word had traveled fast, not the full details, but the essential shape of what had happened. 12 humans and a supporting Vorathisarenthi force had entered Narvik territory and destroyed the colony's command intelligence. The Narvik were in dispersal across the Veth corridor. The immediate threat to the inner corridor worlds had, for the moment, ended. The session began with Vethais presenting the tactical summary. He did it precisely, without drama, because he was Vorathi and precision was how they honored the significance of events. He described the engagement on Beth Saren, the trail to Veth 7's third moon, the assault on the fortress, the chamber. He described the fear projection at maximum range and its effect on every member of the force. And then he described the humans walking through it. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. High Counselor Marath spoke first. The projection had no effect on the humans. It had an effect, Vethais said. They felt it. I spoke directly to Sergeant Van about this. They felt everything it produced. He paused. They functioned anyway. Marath considered this. How is that possible? The chair at the end of the council arc shifted slightly. Ambassador Chen stood. She was wearing the same plain blue uniform she had worn to the first session. She looked the same as she had then, composed, measured, watching the room the way she always watched rooms. "May I?" she said. Vethais nodded and stepped aside. She stood at the podium and looked around the chamber. "You want to know what special forces are," she said. "Not the operational definition, the real one." No one spoke. "Human history is long and not very clean," she said. "We have had a great deal of practice in doing terrible things to each other. Thousands of years of it. Wars, atrocities, systematic violence, the full range of what intelligent creatures are capable of when they are afraid or greedy or angry or simply convinced that they have a good reason." She paused. "We also have a very long history of being afraid of the dark, because for most of our existence, the dark was where the things that killed us lived." She looked at the display. "At some point in that history, different times in different cultures, but the shape is always the same. People began to understand something. The things in the dark that kill you do not become less dangerous if you are afraid of them. The darkness does not become less dark because you dread it. And the creatures that make you feel fear, that use your fear as a weapon against you, they only have that weapon for as long as the fear is in charge." She was quiet for a moment. "So humans began to train people, specifically and deliberately, to go into the worst places they could devise, to experience the worst things they could construct or encounter, not to make these people into something that doesn't feel, but to put so much distance between feeling and functioning that no external force could close that gap." She looked at Marath. "Special Forces is not a rank or a unit designation," she said. "It is the result of a very old human question. What does a person become if they practice being unbreakable long enough?" The chamber was silent for a long time. Councillor Dresch of the Drenathi, who had never spoken much in Grand Council sessions, said quietly, "And they volunteered for this. Your soldiers." "Yes," said Chen. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because someone had to," she said. "Someone always has to go into the dark places. We decided to make sure the people we sent were ready for it." Keth's personal report to Commander Vethais, not the official one, the private one that Vorathi officers sent to their commanders when they wanted to say the things that didn't belong in official documents, was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described the engagement on Beth Saren, accurate and brief. The second described the march to the fortress and the effect of sustained projection exposure. The third described the assault and the chamber. The fourth paragraph said, "I have fought beside 30 different units across 9 engagements. I have been decorated 3 times and I have decorated others. I have believed, for 22 years, that I understood what it meant to be a soldier. I was not wrong about what I understood. I was wrong about the limits of what I thought was possible. These 12 humans have not changed what I believe is good or necessary or honorable in military service. They have changed what I believe is achievable. I do not yet have a word for what I watched in that chamber. I suspect I will spend a considerable time looking for one." Vethais read the report twice. He filed it in the private correspondence archive. He did not respond to it, because Vorathi commanders did not respond to personal reports. But he thought about the 4th paragraph for a long time. "The long patience returned to Earth orbit 26 days after departure." The Accord had prepared something, not a ceremony exactly, but an acknowledgement, a transmission from the Grand Council, brief and formal, expressing the collective gratitude of 43 member species. Councillor Marath had added a personal notation at the end, in Serenthi, which translated roughly as, "My people owe yours something that gratitude is not large enough to cover. We will spend a long time trying to find what the right payment is." Ambassador Chen received the transmission on Earth and forwarded it to Firebase Keller without comment. The 12 members of the unit received it along with their standard post-operation paperwork. They had been back for 3 days before they read it. The Narvek did not disappear from the galaxy. The scattered colony groups eventually found each other or found other Narvek populations in the deeper dark of space. They consolidated. They moved away from the Veth corridor and did not return to it for a very long time. But the Narvek were not a species that forgot. Their biological network carried memory the way their carapace carried scars. The death of the Hydamark was part of their collective record now, and with it, the information the Hydamark had transmitted in its last moments, the data of encountering something that the projection did not stop, something that walked through the fear and kept coming. In the Narvek's biological language, which had no word for human and no previous need for one, they began to use a phrase. The Accord's xenolinguists translated it 2 years later, when they had enough Narvek acoustic data to work from. The phrase was this: the ones who do not lie down. It was not a compliment in the way that Narvek biology was capable of producing compliments, but it was a category, a real one, filed in the collective memory with the weight of significant experience. The Narvek were very old. They had cataloged thousands of species. They had a category for every kind of prey. They had needed to build a new one. Dominic Van was eating a turkey sandwich in the break room of Firebase Keller 6 weeks after they came home. The commissary mustard was still too sweet. He was eating the sandwich anyway. The break room had the same bad lighting it had always had. From the window he could see a slice of earth below, blue and white, turning slowly, ordinary. Akafor was in the gym. Darrow was playing solitaire. Reyes had gone to visit her family for a week and come back 3 days early without explaining why, which was not unusual for her after long operations. Holt had driven 14 hours to see his sister, spent 2 days there and driven back. Maida had sent his paper book to be rebound because the spine had cracked somewhere on the moon of Veth 7 and was waiting for it to come back. He had looked slightly unmoored without it. They had all been home and they had all come back, not because they were required to yet, just because. The orders came through, while Van was on the second half of the sandwich. He read them, read them again. Different coordinates this time. A different corridor in a different part of the Accord's territory, where something had been happening that the member species couldn't resolve alone and had asked for help with. The file was new, but the shape of it was familiar, a problem that required going into a dark place and functioning there until the problem was done. He set down the sandwich. He went to find his team. They were never far. And in the grand chamber on Varro's Prime, in the archives of the Interstellar Accord where 600 years of history were recorded, a new file had been added to the shared catalog that all 43 member species could access. It was not a long file. It contained the engagement data, the tactical reports, the final council session transcript, and the xenolinguistic analysis of the Narvek phrase the translators had worked out. It contained Vethi's official mission report and Keth's official mission report and Orath's short, careful statement that said more in 200 words than most after-action documents said in 2,000. At the end of the file, someone in the Accord's archival office had added a classification tag. The file was tagged under 2 categories. The first category was Narvek Threat Response, Veth Corridor. The second category was something the archivists had created specifically for this entry, because nothing in the existing catalog was sufficient. The tag read Human Special Forces. See also, do not underestimate. The Accord had been wrong about humans before. They had learned this time to leave a note for themselves. In 43 languages, the note said the same thing. There are things in the dark that should be afraid of them.